"Don't call me unless she's dead." Those were the exact words my husband barked at the ICU nurse while I lay unconscious, fighting for my life after an emergency surgery. He thought he was safely tucked away in our suburban home, miles away from the sterile hospital walls, completely unaware that his cold, calculated dismissal was being recorded on an open speakerphone. But what he didn't know, what would ultimately dismantle his entire life, was who was standing right next to that nurse's station, listening to every single word. The nurse froze. The room went dead silent, and a total stranger stepped forward with a look of pure, quiet fury. When I finally woke up 2 days later, a hospital clerk handed me a wrapped box and whispered, "A stranger paid for everything, and he asked me to tell you, this changes everything." Follow my story until the end to see how the trap was sprung. My name is Emily Carter, and at 46 years old, I believed I had cracked the code to a perfect life. For 15 years, I poured my heart, soul, and a substantial personal inheritance into building a marriage with my husband, Richard. To the outside world, we were the ultimate power couple. He was the charismatic, doting husband, and I was his steadfast partner. But perfection is often just a beautifully painted mask. The first crack appeared during my flight home from a grueling 3-day corporate business trip. Sitting in the cramped airplane seat, a sudden blinding pain tore through my abdomen, causing me to gasp for air. Trembling, I pulled out my phone to text Richard for help, but as my screen illuminated, a notification popped up that stopped my heart. It was a preview of a misdirected text from Richard intended for his accountant, reading, "The paperwork is ready. Once she's out of the picture, the assets transfer automatically." Before the horror of those words could fully register, the cabin began to spin. The world turned entirely black as I collapsed into the aisle. The flight attendants rushed to my side, frantically calling for medical assistance as the plane made an emergency landing. I was rushed into emergency surgery the moment the ambulance doors threw open at the hospital, my life hanging by a precarious thread. As the anesthesia dragged me under, those chilling words from Richard's text echoed in my mind. I was fighting for my life on an operating table, completely unaware that the man I loved wasn't praying for my survival. He was actively waiting for my expiration, setting a dark plan into motion while I lay completely helpless. While I lay in the cold silence of the operating room, completely oblivious to the world, the head ICU nurse took my phone to contact my immediate next of kin. She dialed Richard's number, placing the call on speakerphone right at the central nurse's station so she could keep her hands free to monitor my fading vitals. The line rang 3 times before Richard answered. The background was alive with the clinking of glasses, upbeat music, and loud laughter. He was hosting a party. The nurse cleared her throat, her voice urgent. "Mr. Evans, your wife Emily has just undergone major emergency surgery. She is in critical condition in the ICU." The laughter on the other end didn't stop. Richard merely stepped into a slightly quieter area, his voice dripping with an icy, irritated annoyance. "Look, I'm incredibly busy right now," he barked into the receiver. "Don't bother calling me unless she's dead." The line went completely dead. The nurse froze in absolute shock, the surrounding room falling into a horrified, breathless silence. The medical staff couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. But Richard had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was just brushing off an inconvenient hospital worker. He had absolutely no idea that standing right next to that exact nurse's station, listening intently to every single word of his brutal dismissal, was an older, distinguished gentleman. It was Arthur Vance, one of the most powerful and influential figures in the city, whose own daughter was recovering just down the hall. And in that exact moment, as Arthur's eyes narrowed with a quiet, burning fury, Richard's flawless mask didn't just crack, it completely shattered. When I finally drifted back to consciousness, the harsh, white glare of the hospital's fluorescent lights forced my eyes open. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the sterile silence of the room. My throat felt as dry as sandpaper, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated through my abdomen. Groggy and completely disoriented, I forced myself to sit up slightly, looking around the empty space. Richard wasn't there. There were no flowers on the bedside table, no comforting notes, and no frantic husband waiting to see if I would survive. I was entirely alone in my darkest hour. A moment later, the door clicked open, and a sympathetic hospital clerk quietly stepped inside. She held a beautifully wrapped, heavy black box in her hands. She walked over to my bed, her eyes carrying a mixture of pity and deep gravity. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered softly, setting the package gently onto my lap. "You don't need to worry about your medical bills. A gentleman who wishes to remain anonymous has completely settled your entire account in full. He left this box specifically for you, and he asked me to deliver a message. This changes everything." Confused and trembling, I carefully tore away the elegant wrapping paper and lifted the heavy lid, expecting perhaps flowers or a get-well card from an old friend. Instead, resting inside the velvet interior was a sleek digital voice recorder and a thick, official-looking manila folder. On top of the folder was a handwritten note that read, "Your husband didn't know who was listening. Press play." With a racing heart, I pressed the button. The cold, brutal audio of Richard telling the nurse not to call unless I was dead filled the room. Beneath the recorder, the folder contained a private investigator's asset trail, explicitly detailing how Richard had been quietly draining my personal inheritance into a hidden shell corporation while I lay helpless. 24 hours after I woke up to that shattering truth, the hospital room door burst open. Richard rushed inside, his face twisted into a grand theatrical performance of a deeply worried, frantic husband. He practically threw himself toward my bedside, reaching out to grasp my hand while scanning my face for any sign of suspicion. "Emily, thank God you're okay," he cried out, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "I came as absolutely fast as I could. I was stuck out in the mountains on an urgent, unexpected client crisis, and my phone had absolutely no cell reception. When I finally got back into the city and received the hospital's messages, I nearly lost my mind with worry." I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely blank. Thanks to the stranger's documents securely hidden beneath my mattress, I knew every single word coming out of his mouth was an outright lie. He hadn't been in the mountains. He had been throwing a loud celebratory party while waiting for the hospital to call and confirm my death. The sheer psychological pressure to scream at him, to slap his face, and to expose his treachery right then and there was almost overwhelming. But I took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of inner strength I possessed, and played completely dumb. I let my eyes well up with fake tears, squeezing his hand back as if I believed every word. "Oh, Richard, I was so terrified," I whispered weakly, putting on the performance of a fragile, deeply grateful wife. I let him believe his dark plan to quietly siphon away my corporate shares during my recovery was going perfectly. As he smiled, thinking he had successfully manipulated me once again, I was already secretly planning my next move, ready to meet my mysterious benefactor. The next morning, I quietly slipped out of the house to meet the mysterious stranger at a private, high-security downtown office. Arthur Vance was waiting for me. Up close, he radiated the quiet authority of a retired billionaire philanthropist and elite corporate attorney. He didn't waste time with empty pleasantries. He looked at me with deep respect and revealed a truth that left me breathless. Richard's logistics company wasn't just struggling. It had been systematically defrauding Arthur's own multi-million-dollar charitable foundation for the past 2 years through inflated shipping invoices. "I've been tracking his movements for months," Arthur explained, sliding a fresh legal document across the desk. But Richard was clever. He routed everything through a complex web of shell companies. I couldn't launch a full federal investigation because I lacked the internal signature access to prove he was the sole operator. And that's where you come in, Emily. Arthur revealed that because my personal inheritance had funded the launch of the business, I was legally designated as the primary corporate trustee. I held the absolute veto power and the ultimate signature rights. Richard's entire plan to transfer the assets while I was incapacitated was a desperate race to strip me of that power before Arthur's legal team caught up to him. Arthur leaned forward, his voice firm. You have a choice, Emily. You can let him take everything and remain the victim. Or you can sign this joint disclosure, authorize my elite legal team to audit the accounts, and let us turn the tables completely. We can set a trap he will never see coming. Looking at Arthur, the fear vanished. I picked up the pen, signed my name, and drew the ultimate battle lines. By Saturday evening, the trap was perfectly set. Richard had thrown a lavish celebratory dinner party at our estate, ostensibly to toast my miraculous recovery. In reality, the room was filled with his wealthy business associates, investors, and his personal accountant. Richard was beaming, radiating his usual charismatic charm as he played the role of the doting, relieved husband to perfection. As the main course was being served, he gently clutched my shoulder, leaning down to whisper that it was time. He signaled his accountant, who stepped forward and placed a thick stack of asset transfer documents right next to my wine glass. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," Richard announced loudly, clinking his glass. "My brave wife Emily has agreed to sign over her corporate trustee shares tonight, allowing our company to expand into its next glorious phase." The room erupted into polite applause. Richard handed me a sleek gold pen, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. But instead of picking up the pen, I stood up and reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out a small remote control. I clicked the button, activating the hidden Bluetooth speaker system I had installed throughout the dining room earlier that afternoon. Suddenly, a loud, crisp audio recording began to blast through the house. It was Richard's unmistakable voice, cold and ruthless, echoing off the walls. "Look, I'm incredibly busy right now. Don't bother calling me unless she's dead." The room went dead silent. The applause vanished instantly as his associates stared in absolute horror. Richard's face turned completely white, the gold pen slipping from his trembling fingers. Before he could utter a single word of defense, the grand front doors threw open. Arthur Vance walked directly into the dining room, flanked by 4 federal fraud investigators. The federal investigators moved swiftly, confiscating Richard's phone and laptop right in front of his stunned dinner guests. Within weeks, the ironclad evidence provided by Arthur Vance tore his fraudulent empire to shreds. Facing high-profile corporate fraud, embezzlement charges, and an unforgiving legal system, Richard was stripped of everything. Our divorce was finalized shortly after, leaving him completely bankrupt and facing a lengthy prison sentence, while my inheritance and assets were fully restored and secured. 3 months later, I stood on the sun-drenched balcony of my new seaside home, breathing in the fresh coastal air. At 46 years old, I wasn't just surviving, I was truly thriving, completely independent and free from the shadow of a man who had wished for my end. If you found out your partner was waiting for you to pass away, would you have played the quiet game like I did, or confronted them immediately? Comment your city and your thoughts below.